Well, I am showing 2 o'clock straight up. Shall we kind of get started? I know we have some people still coming on, but it'll take me a second. I would like to introduce everybody. Thanks for coming, everyone, to the second English Faculty Professional Development Session. It's facilitated by Kansas Board of Regents. We have three wonderful experts who are going to be talking to you today. Melanie Burdick, Dr. Burdick from Washburn University, Dr. Casey Reed from the University of Kansas, and Kathy McCoskey of Butler Community College. If you guys are ready, I will pull up the slides. If there's any other housekeeping things that you all want to talk about as I do that, please feel free.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to put in the chat. You all probably saw this when you registered, but maybe not, or maybe you need the link again. But I wanted to make sure you have the link to the KBOR page where all of the resources and the recording from the last session are located. Sam put everything that was in the chat, our slides and the recording and a few other things, maybe even on that page. So I want to make sure you have that available. Kathy and Casey, do you have anything else before we dive in? All right.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about scaffolding, but Casey and Kathy are the real experts in the Zoom room. They both know a lot about the teaching of reading, and I know it's something that I would like to do better. And I know my faculty at Washburn, my colleagues, we've all been talking a lot about how to do a better job working reading instruction into our composition classes. So let's go ahead and you can go ahead and forward the slides. Just to remind you that this is the second in a series of 4 sessions. And you can see that the 2 that are coming up for the rest of the semester, the one that's on Friday, the February 28th, is going to be about students' non-cognitive and affective needs. And I think that's going to be especially helpful to fold into this this co-requisite training because of the developmental students. Often they have some other complications in their lives, and this is something that will really help us think about what to weave into that co-rec class. And then the last one, the April the 4th, there will be time for small groups from different institutions to work together or to kind of debrief some of their ideas with each other. So make sure that if you're considering coming on the 4th, to think about who would be a good team to attend that session in particular to work together for planning purposes. All right, forward, please. And then just again, the slides are going to be probably taking up most of your screen for this session. But do what you need to do. Please participate as actively as you are comfortable. We will have a break about halfway through, a 10-minute break. So just know that that will be coming. And then we always love to have comments and questions in the chat so that we can, and those will be saved for you to go back to later as well. Next slide, please. All right, so we are going to have you do something just to get started right off the bat. If you are on a computer where you can access a course syllabus for you, especially if you have first year comp, go ahead and pull that up. And we want you to think, if you don't have your syllabus with you, that's cool, but you probably know it so well, you can identify these points without it in front of you. But think about the first time that you assign a reading in your class. The first time you discuss paraphrasing and summarizing using sources. The first time students prepare for peer review. And the very first time that students receive feedback for revision. And that could be feedback from you, or I think it could be feedback from peers as well. So see if you can think through those 4 moments in your syllabus, in your course schedule. And we're going to be doing something more with this in a little bit. So we wanted you to, though, be prepared to discuss these or to think through some more activities with these. All right, next slide. And so just to go over today's objectives, Kathy and I are going to talk about how to scaffold instruction. We did notice from the questions, the KWL chart that we did last time, that there were quite a few questions about how to scaffold that. Like if I'm doing these activities and these assignments in 101, what do I do? How do I scaffold activities that are going to be put into the co-requisite course? And then we're going to be talking about, Casey and Kathy will be talking about how to integrate reading and the reading cycle. And then finally, Casey's going to kind of circle around to some of the things that were issues that came up during the first session that we felt like maybe we needed a little bit more time to discuss. So she's going to cover some of those things as well. Site. All right, I'm going to pass it on over to Kathy now.
Okay, I trust everybody can hear me. So welcome everybody. It's great to see familiar names there and some familiar faces in your pictures. So I want to start first with, Sam, can we go back a slide just for the general overview slide? Thank you. So scaffolding, let's think about the meaning of scaffolding. Is when we're intentionally building the co-requisite ahead of the college level course. So if you think about the role of scaffolding in improving and building buildings, it's very similar to what we're trying to do in the classroom. It's a good analogy for it. The work that we do with the co-requisite course, which at Butler is called Fundamentals of English, or EGO 6.0, if I happen to call it that, would be that we're building their knowledge and their skill with practice and their confidence ahead of what we're doing in English 101 on key essential tasks and areas. And it's important to, as much as possible, make every assignment and activity worthwhile and connected to English 101. And I assume all of us are not interested in doing busy work in our classes, even though sometimes students accuse us of that, whether they say it or not. But the more that I've worked with ALP over the years, the more I'm trying to, ALP is what we call the co-requisite courses at Butler, Accelerated Learning Program. The more I'm trying to really narrow down what I'm doing in the co-requisite classroom to make sure everything is intentionally connected to what I'm going to be doing in English 101 to support that. Of course, this is all based on backward design from the college level course. I think that goes without saying, but I want to make sure that we think about that. Scaffolding works well if you have the same instructor teaching both the college level course and the co-requisite course, because you can manage, when the workload is due, how much workload there is, of course, and what kind of skills you're building and practicing. So, okay, next slide, please. So I have some examples here from my own co-requisite course. English 060 is Fundamentals of English at Butler, and English 101 is Composition 1. And I wanted to just share some of the connections here. So the arrows are pointing to, the connections in the course. So the first one under week 1 for English 060, you see introduce SWA. And here we call those short writing A, short writing B. We just used what Peter Adams from Baltimore was using to identify those. And in some versions of my courses, I've done something with an NPR interview podcast called A Light Bulb Moment, which is a lovely interview with a woman who struggled with learning disabilities and getting a job, and then how she overcame those. It's really encouraging. It's short. It's really accessible. And so in one version of my course, I have my students listen to that and then start doing some pre-writing brainstorming for their first short essay for English 101 in the first week. And then you can see how the arrow then goes down to English 101 in week 2, where we talk about essay structure, and we introduce the first essay. Now in fundamentals in English 060, as I introduced the short writing A, I would be talking about essay structure. And probably there's several of you who do this too, but I like to refer to that as a hamburger. So that's a great illustration for it. I got that originally years ago from a poster I saw in someone else's classroom. And so we talk about just a really easy to understand illustration of how a hamburger is like an essay with the hamburger bun at the top and the bottom, the intro and the conclusion, and everything in between. I don't have to explain to you all. So that means by the time we get to English 101 in week 2, and we're talking about essay structure with some of the same illustration, the fundamentals class, those students feel confident, or at least more confident, learning that information and hearing it again in Comp 1. So we also see that happen with week 1 in English 101, where the students watch my video that I've pre-recorded called The Writing Process, going over steps of the writing process and just how I view those and what I expect and what I plan for them to be doing in those steps, so that when the fundamental students get to those steps in week 2, continuing into week 2, they already know from English 101, what those are, and they're putting them into practice. So, okay, next slide, please. And then here we just see a continuation of that. In week 3 for fundamentals, in this lesson plan, I'm practicing quotations. I use something I call the ice cream sandwich format. And it is funny, I think that most of my illustrations seem to have something to do with food. So it's too bad when that's right around the noon hour, but it works well as an illustration. So practicing quoting is something that they learn in fundamentals and then practice that format with the signal phrase, the quote, and then integrating after it. And we do that with a low stakes assignment. And then they're preparing for week 4 in English 101, where I'm introducing essay 2, which is a synthesis essay that includes quoting. So in week 4 of English 101, that's where that class is learning about quotations. And so I really see the confidence building in the fundamental students because they know that information or they've heard it before the 101 students have, and they've practiced it. So I think that's the main thing for that slide. Okay, and then the next slide, please. And here we just see that pattern continuing, where in essay 2 for English 101 on the right column, we're starting our pre-writing and we're doing our outlining, and then in English fundamentals, you see how in this case, after that, we're stressing more about outlining. So there's sometimes the connections work backwards, but generally you want them to work forwards. But they also do this often, especially in the middle of semester. So let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. No, I think that's it. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from my colleague, Associate Professor Amanda Hash, and she and I are in a community practice group at Butler to share our teaching practices. Right now, we're both piloting a blended format of ALP. And she shared with me that she does this often in her course, where on the board in the co-requisite class, she'll show she'll show the students on the board how the assignments that they're working on now, the projects they're working on, connect to each other. So you can see here how she's drawn arrows from 060 to 101, showing them that connection. And that helps them understand, why they're doing those things in 060, which is very important, I think, for any of us. We want to know why. We all have very limited time. And it really does help them value the course more and see why it's important to do well in that course and not just to blow off that course as some extra kind of thing. Also, it's a good way for the instructor to check themselves and see if, again, is what I'm doing intentionally scaffolding and not just like extra, or am I off track somehow? Okay, next slide, please. And then this is where I adapted what Amanda shared with me, and actually did this the first week of class this semester. You see what I have in the left column, English 101. I showed them this week, this is what we're doing. Next week, this is what we're doing. Just them, in a big picture format, not all the little details of things. And then on the right side, I show them how, look, the stuff you're doing for homework, because in blended format, the online homework that they have to do could be easy for them to say, I don't think I want to do that. So I'm trying to show them, look, this homework you're doing is intentionally building and preparing you for what you're doing next week in the 101 class. So I think that's all I have there. So now we're just getting to a point where we want to allow any kind of questions so far. And Melanie, are you managing the chat, or who's managing the chat?
I am watching the chat. I don't see any right now, but if anyone has any questions they'd like to unmute or
Yeah.
chat, please feel free to do that right now.
Okay. Well, we sure can move on.
Oh, there is a question from Francis that says, in your blended format, is the online section 060 or 101?
Oh, yeah. It is 060, actually. I know that might seem surprising. We started piloting last fall, so we're continuing to try that out and continuing it because it seemed to work. But it is really important to make the students aware that the online work, basically the second part of that course during the week, is essential. And that doesn't always work, but I feel like I'm getting better at making it fit better and convincing them more by the ways I've shared that it is valuable and important.
It's a great question. Any others?
Thank you.
Oh, and I should have said earlier, we did see that there were a lot of questions and concerns about how to do this online. So we're going to try and weave that in throughout all of our presentation as well.
Oh, could I say something about that? Melanie? So I'm going to go ahead and just share that actually the scaffolding that I showed you in those 3 slides is from my online course. So I should have said that. So it it looks very similar to what I'm doing in my face-to-face classes. So it works very well that way. Um, Also, I wanted to say, I forgot this, that I have over time started to be more mindful of how much I'm having my co-requisite students do outside the classroom. They always have homework. And like I was talking about the blended homework, for example, but even my regular sections would. But I'm very mindful about like how heavy that homework is, and that it's very intentionally scaffolding. And then in the 060, the fundamentals co-rec classroom, I'm using my time more to accomplish like starting a draft or getting a big chunk of a draft written, or so that they're not doing the heavier tasks outside that classroom because there's enough going on already with the one-on-one work and the one-on-one homework.
Okay, next slide, please. I think we'll go ahead and move on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of low stakes activities that you can use for scaffolding. And some of this you're already probably aware of, but it's a good reminder to us that these low stakes activities are important because we need the students often to do more practice before they are having to engage in the high stakes, the formal essays that we're having them write. It also allows us to give them a lot of feedback before, again, that high stakes task. And then we can also see when students need something to be retaught. So some of the ways you can organize your low stakes activity is to think about it as different activities that slowly release the students to do more independent work on and more challenging work on their own. So the first kind of level of this is a teacher-led activity, and you can think of that as a lecture. We don't do a lot of lecturing in our composition classes, I'm guessing, but maybe some mini lectures and a few, maybe a demonstration. Or also assigning a reading assignment that the teacher chooses for a particular purpose. So those are more focused on the teacher leading that activity. Moving further away from the teacher and giving the students more independence is then what's called guided practice, where the students are practicing whatever they are working to learn, but they're doing that in a small group or assisted with the teacher. So this could be a small group assignment, a step-by-step practice of some type of writing or task that you do together in class. But it's where the students are actively engaged in what you're wanting them to learn, but it's not an independent task. It's something they're doing with others. And then finally is the independent practice. So they're doing it on their own. They're doing it unassisted, but it's low stakes and it's usually a smaller piece or somehow otherwise related to the larger high stakes task. So those are just a good way to think about what are the activities that I'm going to use to scaffold in the co-requisite section. All right, next slide, please. So for example, I wanted you to see here are some examples of scaffolding activities that could be done. And this would be just what I would do in my regular 101 class. So I do a lot of these activities in the traditional 101 class with my students as we're working towards a narrative essay assignment. And you can see that in class, I might show them here some of the things that we associate with narrative writing. And then we look at a model essay in small groups. They can get together and identify those attributes. And we might do a in-class writing together about a particular piece of that narrative essay. And then finally, for the independent practice, students could be doing something small, like they're going to practice writing a descriptive paragraph that would go with a narrative essay. All right, next slide, please. And what's important to remember, and I think Kathy really explained this well, is that for the correct section, those students often need to have even more practice and practice ahead. So they see these things before they're introduced in the regular 101 class. So again, some of the correct activities could look the same as what you're doing in 101, or they could be different. But it's important to have more of these for the students who are in the correct section, because they need a little more practice. And also as the instructor, you can see where they're feeling challenged about some of this information, and you can reteach it in that section of the correct section. Finally, it's important for the students to get lots of feedback in that correct section so that they build their confidence. And so having more of these practice activities and low stakes activities are really helpful for that as well. All right, next slide. All right, and I'm going to put this in the chat. The next thing that we're going to do is an activity where you're going to think about one of the, sorry, I can't get the link and everything else. So that you can think about your own activities, your own papers in your English 101 class, and then consider how you could create some scaffolding assignments. And I think, let me get it.
Have headphones.
I'm trying to get the link, 1 sec. Casey or Kathy, are you able to grab that link for me? I'm having a hard time getting it for some reason. Oh, wait, I think I got it.
Here it is.
Got it? Okay, awesome. So if you click on this link, it'll take you to, and Sam, you can go ahead and take the slides down for now, the PowerPoint slides. If you click on that link, that's going to take you to a group of other slides that are for us to fill in. And so I can see everybody's getting there. All right. And so the very first slide here is the one that I just shared with you about showing some activities that could be scaffolded towards a narrative essay assignment. The second slide is one that Kathy did for an online co-rec class, and some scaffolded activities that she's done there. So what would be great is if you could pick a slide, and I think we have 20 blank ones, and we have a lot more people than 20 slides worth. So you could add a slide, copy a slide if they get filled up. But think of an assignment that you do in your class, a large, more high stakes assessment, and then fill in the slide with some scaffolded activities that could be added. And then what we're hoping is we have a whole lot of really great ideas that we're crowdsourcing with all the people here today. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing?
And I just added a bunch of slides, so we should have enough for everyone to
Thanks,
jump
Casey.
in. Yeah, totally.
All right, so we'll give you a few minutes to just work on that a little bit. And I do want to say, I see somebody's doing an annotated bibliography, which is awesome. And that reminded me that each of the slides says blank essay. And if that's not appropriate for your high stakes assessment, please, it doesn't have to be an essay.
I love the range of kinds of activities that everyone's putting in. Skits, for example, very fun. I love the sort of universal design and learning kind of activities that everyone's talking about. This is really cool to see.
I'm also really excited to see all the unusual types of essays that are being put up here on the slides. They're really creative and cool. All right, it looks like folks are finishing up those slides, but you can certainly keep working on those through the rest of our presentation. And then what we'll do at the end is we'll kind of clean out the empty ones so that we'll have a whole series of great ideas for different essay assignments that you can keep or share with your colleagues. Before we move on, are there any questions or would anybody like to chat or talk about some of the things that they're seeing in these activities that you're sharing?
I would love to borrow the procrastination assignment. Um, I really am loving all the assignments that are popping up. These are great.
And the bogus claim one, I thought looked good.
Hmm. And fun ways of approaching descriptive and exemplification. Yeah, just really cool.
Great. Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and move on. Sam, if you want to go ahead and pull up the slides and let's see, is it Casey? Are you up next? All right.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to shift a little bit on our gears here, but we are going to be back in this document in a little bit. So we want to start getting you thinking specifically about how you might scaffold in reading into your classes. So I'm going to talk about some theoretical kinds of implications around this. Kathy's going to talk, we're going to give a little break after I talk, and then Kathy is going to talk a little bit about the reading cycle. And one quick note I do want to make is in the presentation, at the references, I've included a link to a pretty comprehensive little source list for you all about a range of ways that we might approach reading in our context, whether that is in a classroom or even a writing center environment. So just FYI on that. Okay, Sam, next slide, please. So we want to give you just a couple of minutes to do some writing. And we're probably not going to, for time reasons, be able to share, but this is just to kind of get you thinking a little bit. So here are the questions. In what ways do you already bring attention to reading or literacy practices in your classes? What are some of the activities that already require or encourage some kind of explicit attention to reading and or a range of literate practices? And specifically discuss any reading activities related to the first class reading and how you set that up, paraphrasing and summarizing discussions, peer review, and then feedback. And then a couple other questions to consider. What do you see as the function of exploring reading and or literacy practices in our composition or writing classes? What outcomes are you trying to achieve by integrating attention to reading or literacies into your class? In other words, what's to be gained by paying more explicit attention to reading or different literacy practices in writing classes? And we'll give you at least 3 to 5 minutes or so to write. I completely agree with you, Dylan. I think over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah, we want to have them read. We need to have them read. Yeah, definitely. We're at about 3 minutes. Let me go ahead and give you all another minute or two. Yeah. I know for myself, I feel like this is the only time when I get to think about things like this. So I'm gonna make sure you feel like you have some space for that. Rounding the corner on 5 minutes. Yes, Maria, that was one of the first things I figured out as I was starting to turn more attention to reading in my classes, how important it was to start with this kind of an assignment, to really focus our attention on reading and writing as these meaning-making activities that go together and really having students focus on one piece. Initially, my response to that when a colleague suggested that was that I had come from an institution where we were required to have, longer multiple source-based essays very quickly in 101. And I really appreciated that focus on one source. And let's see how you're thinking about this. And that summary and response really helps with that and giving them the choice, which is such a great deal. Yeah, that's awesome, Janet. Please do. For those of you who are really, one of the things we did not put in here, but could have talked about is how much um, reading learning loss we have as a result of the pandemic and the fact that we have some research suggesting it's going to be pretty hard. There's a group of students that are going to hit in the next 2 years who are not going to be able to make up that reading and math skills learning loss by the time they hit us. And so, on top of our already existing reading needs, we know that we also have a whole group of students coming towards us who are definitely going to need more attention to reading. Yeah. I love that, Kate, that yes, knowing that I've actually taught some specialized sections of courses that were just for students with learning disabilities. Um, and yeah, taking it down to smaller sections, that's a great idea. And working in small groups, lots of different types is a great idea because it exposes them to the fact that you have to read differently, right? For different types of things that you're engaging with. Um, that's awesome. Yeah, Abby. I love, by the way, that everyone is jumping in on this. This is great. Um, yeah, helping students practice understanding how written text doesn't simply transmit meaning. Yeah, and that it is created. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have seen sometimes in there are different theories of how to approach reading. And when certain theoretical perspectives don't take into account that meaning making that goes on. Yeah, that's so different. That's great. Yes, I love that you're making the YouTube videos available with folks reading out loud. Because for so many students, they haven't been exposed to that very much since they were in second, third, fourth grade, right? And that that's huge because hearing a text, as you know, if you all like to listen to books, um, can create such a different experience, and you can get some different meaning out of it. So that's a fabulous idea. I love everything that everyone is contributing. This is great. So thank you all. Sam, can we go ahead and jump in to our next slide? Great. So I'm providing you this quote just sort of as something to think about the fact that when we talk about reading, which is one part of our literacy practices, um, that these aren't neutral practices, as we oftentimes talk about them. Um, they are attached to values, and those values might compete when they're in the mix with other literacy practices. Um, and so I know what I've found is as I've been in different institutions, some institutions value certain kinds of literacy practices over others, and then spend time and energy promoting those over others. Um, and when we think about literacies, I'm very invested in research around lifelong literacy developments and the fact that as we go through life, um, there's no end stage, right? So we're always accumulating and hitting different sort of points in our literacy development. Um, and because of all the ways those literacy resources and contexts can vary, that teachers and students at one institution may have greater access to literacies than at other institutions. So given that we are all from a range of institutions, I just wanted to make sure I kind of throw that out there as something to be thinking about as we're thinking about the different values and our contexts. I actually, before I was at KU, I was at a very small community college in Northwest Colorado. And I walked into my office space, which was in a room described as the library. Y'all, there was no library. There was like, we had maybe 100, 150 books hanging out in a room. There was no librarian. I was really confused. I thought there was going to be a librarian because I was in a library. We did not have a lot of resources available to us. And so my students were much more dependent on me to provide them with the literacy tools that they were going to be navigating. So it was a really fascinating context, and I'm sure you all are in some different contexts as well. So could we go to the next slide, please, Sam? So today, for simplicity's sake, I have much larger presentations about this. We're exploring more about some of the different theories of reading, but we're going to primarily talk about Ellen Carrillo's work. And if you aren't familiar with her, she is someone in our field who has really focused in the last 10 years on how we meaningfully integrate reading into our classes. And you can get to the link on her book, which is free online, Mindful Reading. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that she talks about trying to get students to engage with reading as a mindful practice. And the mindful part is recognizing that they're going to need a range of reading strategies for different purposes, different contexts. They can't use the same approach for every assignment. Within our class, outside of our classes, they're going to encounter a lot of different things and ways they need to shift how they're thinking about reading so that they can do the kinds of things we're asking them to do. So a lot of what she talks about is the metacognitive basis of reading. So she does stick with a more cognitive model of reading. There are more sort of culturally based models of literacy and literacies that include reading as a cognitive component, but also talk about the ways that all of our cultural understanding of things impacts um, how we navigate different kinds of literacy tasks. Um, tends to take it's not a super narrow, but she does tend to take a more cognitive sort of approach um, that emphasizes students becoming knowledgeable, deliberate, and reflective about how they read and the demands that different contexts place on their reading. So part of what she emphasizes is making sure that teachers are deciding what strategies and approaches you want to emphasize. Some examples being annotation, which some of you have already brought up, rhetorical reading, which is very different, right? To read rhetorically, and to try to think about like, how did someone try to put this together for a given audience? It actually requires some theory of mind. And for those of you who might be working with neurodiverse students, and I have taught some specialized sections of comp for neurodiverse students, that theory of mind, trying to get inside the head of another person and to anticipate and understand why they made the choices they made can be incredibly difficult. And so rhetorical reading is something that needs to be practiced in some pretty deep ways before we send our students off to do that. Close reading, which many of you may be familiar with if you have a literature background, because that is a theoretical approach that emanates from that field, amongst others. Says does kind of approach, and then reading like a writer. So those are a couple of the ways that she talks about this. And then focusing on teaching students how to learn to read using those different kinds of approaches with different tasks. So some of her specific informing theories are reader response, writing about writing, writing for transfer, genre theories, and then some psychological theories of mindfulness. So next slide, please. So these are a couple of things to just kind of know and be aware of, that when reading scholars are thinking about what is sort of the theoretical lens you're using when you're thinking about reading. More literacy, I'm going to start with the literacy centric. If you have a kind of a cultural literacies approach, then this might feel familiar or resonate with you. Literacy narratives are one more literacy centric kind of an approach. And I think I see them a lot in all the writing centers I've been in, and I know I myself have assigned them. So this is actually a fairly common assignment in a lot of English 101, Composition 1 classes, where we're having students think not just about reading, but themselves as literate beings who've been in all these different literacy contexts that are informed by various facets of their backgrounds, right? And so Carter actually has a lovely book that takes people through how an entire you could apply it in a co-requisite ALP format. At the time, she was primarily writing for a standalone basic writing or developmental writing class, but takes you through an entire course looking at literate practices and how you might explore that and research. So that's one particular approach. And then some more reading centric approaches that are more focused on just, reading as a more confined cognitive sort of, semiotic meaning making activity. We get Carrillo talking about reading journals. Michael Bunn's work. Michael Bunn is another scholar in recent years who's done a lot of work around reading in our field. Talks a lot about helping students to do textual analysis on sample texts. Has a really lovely article that I like that helped me think about how, yeah, I just sort of like throw these sample texts in front of my students and expect them to know how to read them. And I realized in reading his work, whoa, I need to slow this down. I need to really unpack this more for my students and how to do this. Salvatore and Donahue have been doing this kind of work for a long time and have been talking about reading in our field. They talk quite a bit about annotation and paraphrasing, summarizing, and other source interpretation. Rhetorical reading and analysis, we've got lots of people doing some work around that. Michael Bunn also has a nice article about peer workshops and how to help students with, again, slowing that down and helping and like really modeling for students. How is it that I am reading this text and responding to it? And so how might you also do this as you're reading your fellow students' texts? Not just as someone looking at it at, anyway. And then finally, last but not least, Howard Tinberg has kind of gotten into this as well and provide some specific information on how to help students with trying to figure out and read our feedback as teachers and then how to respond to that. So those are just a couple of sources. And like I said, there's a lot of information packed into our references page about that. Next slide, please. So here's kind of a few insights from the field. And I know for many of you, some of these things may feel fairly basic, but hopefully there's one or two that might feel like it resonates or strikes as a new idea. There's almost agreement. I'm careful about saying that, but a lot of folks in our field would like us to select fewer readings and give them more attention. That again was something that was a big shift for me. I was used to, boom, 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 hitting students with tons and tons and tons of reading. And what most folks will say is that we hit them with so much that that's part of the reason they're not doing the reading. They're not engaging as deeply as we might want them to. And if we're really focusing on helping them learn to read the kinds of texts they're going to have to read in college, that we need to slow it down, focus on fewer, and spend more time on each one of those. They also talk a lot about talking about why you choose readings and really making sure these are meaningfully integrated into the class. Now, I know that we're all choosing these things for me. We have reasons, right? But it's really important to articulate those reasons and to talk about that quite a bit with students so that they understand why they're being required to do the reading and what they're supposed to be getting from it. Bartholomew and Petrosky have one of the most seminal works in our field from 1986. There's lots of versions of their work now. And one of the bigger takeaways from their work on making sure we're integrating reading into our classes is not to shy away from difficult readings because it can be so helpful for students to get exposed to them as long as we're slowing down enough to give students the time with them. And then for those of you who do tend more towards being a little more literacy informed, choosing readings that expose students to a range of literacies and literate practices can be a good idea if that is your theoretical leaning. So next slide, please. Another piece of advice from several scholars in the field is to talk about your own reading and literacy approaches, experience, and habits. And it's not on the slide, but to model that. That's one of the better ways that we can do this is to actually talk students through our own thinking processes as we're doing a reading in class with them. Can be a really powerful way to show students what that metacognitive process looks like. And some folks will even recommend that we try to pick something we haven't read that might be a little more difficult for us. I know that can feel a little vulnerable, but it can be a great way to show students that even we struggle with reading tasks, and that can be helpful. And then having students talk and write about their reading approaches, experience, and habits. And then another approach is collaborating with colleagues across the disciplines and in the workplace to find ways to demystify the reading process. And that can be accomplished. We'll mention reading apprenticeship a time or two today, but West Ed has a fabulous book and training I've gone through, I think 2 or 3 times now, called Reading Apprenticeship. And it is really geared towards having folks from multiple disciplines come and learn this particular approach to kind of metacognitive engagement with reading in a variety of disciplines. So next slide, please. And now we're going to see if anyone has any questions and give everyone a 10-minute break. So feel free to unmute if you'd like. Thanks, Melanie, for throwing in that West Ed Reading Apprenticeship link. Yeah, Deborah.
Bathroom for leaving.
What?
Go bathrooms probably.
No.
Makes you.
If they have anything that doesn't have dairy. Right.
I think we might be hearing someone unmuted right now. Accidentally. It's okay. Nate, a strong proponent of metacognition. Composition isn't just a humanities prereq. The course often includes a significant other STEM students. Yeah. There's considerable pushback. Yeah. Problem solving over textual analysis. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I'm actually teaching a technical writing class right now that is specifically for students who are in a high school and community college linked trades program. So the students are primarily learning like HVAC and welding, and those are the kinds of, programs they're going through. And they sure don't like doing textual analysis. And what I do tend to do is focus my reading strategies on the kinds of things they're going to be reading in that particular context, because it is part of that pathway that they're in. Though I do like to find pieces that are about their field that kind of get them to practice a little textual analysis. Not knowing where their lives are going to take them, right? So yeah, but I do definitely try to navigate that in ways where I give, and in mixed classes, try to give them, some options when possible. But I'm curious what other folks might do or what your thoughts are.
I think it's also helpful to find an article that might be in on the internet for a mass, for like a lay audience, and then go to where the research study was published and let students look at the 2 different articles for different audiences. And we've done that before. I know there was one article I found that was pretty complex biology. It was a biology article, and it was about mushrooms and the components in mushrooms that, I don't know, the different chemical components. And then it was watered down for a website to say, if you eat mushrooms, you will live forever, or something like that. And so we looked at how it was written as a scientific journal article and how it was written for a lay audience. And that was kind of cool, I think, for some of my STEM students to see that.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I know it's picking texts when we have students from very different, academic backgrounds and disciplines can be really difficult. We'll go ahead and give everyone, what do we want to say, about another 7-8 minutes break? Sound okay? Okay, so let's come back around, say 3:15. Anyone? Okay, and then I'll hand off to Kathy.
Kathy and Sam, I believe.
Yes.
Hi, this is Geneva Diamond from Dodge City Community College.
Hey.
Um, you guys are in charge of the meeting, right? Yeah.
There we go.
I am actually gonna exit. I have just returned from the flu.
Oh,
So, yeah, I
I'm
am
sorry.
just going downhill really quick again.
Oh, take
Yeah.
care. Yes.
Yeah, our campus here is just decimated right now. It's just
Oh.
spreading everywhere.
Oh dear.
And so, yeah, I'm just kind of wearing out pretty quickly. I am going to try and come back and watch the rest of it.
Right.
And look at some of these things. And I just wanted to thank you. It's actually been quite helpful so far, but I don't want to wipe myself out for the rest of the
No, don't do
weekend.
that. Right. And the recordings will be posted. Sam, is good to get those posted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Um,
I'm sorry. That's my camera tends to look up over me. Okay, yeah, I'll come back and review it. And then the other question I have is, I'm leaving early today. But will there be any way for confirmation that I attended the first Zoom meeting, and I've written down for the one in February and April. But will there be any way for confirmation that I can submit for a professional development credit? For having attended the meetings?
Probably what would you need from us, Geneva? I could provide a letter or something.
Yeah, or something, yeah, just something like that. And when we get to the end of all three of them, I'll remember to ask again.
All right. Yeah. just shoot me an
And
email
like this
too.
one, since I have to leave early, I wouldn't expect full credit, credit for this one.
No
But once
worries.
we get to the end of the series, I'll check in with you again.
Sounds great.
So
Feel better.
yes. Take care.
it's awful. You guys have a good weekend, and thank you.
Yeah.
too.
Thank you. Take care. Okay. Are we back to the slide, Sam? Well, it's 3:16, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about what we call the reading cycle. Could be called a lot of things, but that's what we've called it at Butler after learning about it from Katie Hearn from California Acceleration Project, and how she uses this reading instructional strategy to connect reading, writing, and critical thinking together. So this is really for anybody who includes reading in their assignments. And I'm going to go over what the cycle is and then just the different aspects of those. So next slide, please. This will work for any kind of your format. So it could be online, it could be hybrid, blended, any of those. So I've definitely used it in my face-to-face, my blended, and my online. So the reading cycle has 4 components, and we have before reading, during reading, after reading, and on to writing. So you have the whole process of reading on to writing here together. So I'm going to go over each step. So if you could go to the next slide. So first of all, I just want to share how the reading cycle supports how the brain thinks and learns. And that's largely from the use of practicing and repeating over time, just like how any of us learn. I remember hearing Dr. Rita Smilkstein say in a conference that a biological change in the brain is what learning is. And that's because of that use of time and practice. And so the reading cycle allows for that connection to happen. And including things like engaging prior knowledge, building background knowledge. So next slide, please. So before reading, at Butler, we've broken this into pre-reading and previewing, and this builds confidence and interest. Pre-reading would be when you're building students' prior knowledge and background knowledge, engaging their prior knowledge and building background knowledge. So for example, this first part of the semester, I've introduced my English 101 class to an excerpt from Sonia Sotomayor's My Beloved World. It's the portion where she leaves home and goes to Princeton and how she feels like a fish out of water and what she does to help herself adjust to that and to grow stronger. It's a great excerpt for the classroom and for that class. So what I've done with that is provide a relevant short video about her and also some biography information that we've looked at together, read together, and then I provided more for them to look at on their own. So before we start reading, I provide that background information and we really talk about who she is, where she's coming from. And I'm sure that's something that you're familiar with, but it's easy to miss that step when we're in a rush, especially being in the writing classroom, I think. So other ways to do that I've got listed here, like using a KWL, reading journals or quick writes about what do you already know about whatever it's going to be. Lecture notes, certainly, like in an online class, you might provide a page of lecture notes about that person, but it'd be better to provide, I think, a video, something that would grab their attention along with that. Also, you could use a discussion board interaction after they did previewing of these things, pre-reading of these things. Previewing has to do more with the reading task. And this is where it's helpful for the teacher to provide a reading purpose. So before I send them on to read that, the first time they're reading a portion of it, I will say, this time I want you to be looking for how Sonia Sotomayor felt when she was at Princeton and what made her uncomfortable. And then what are some things she did to help herself with that? So to give them really a path through that text. And so that helps a lot. I try to always remember to do that. I don't always remember, but I try to always remember to do that. Also, if the text is chopped up into different sections, I'll note, how the headings are used. We'll look at some of the more difficult concepts. I look ahead at that. Like this time, I pulled up pictures of Princeton, and I don't think any of my students in the classroom really had seen pictures of Princeton before. And we talked about how that doesn't look at all like where we are here at my campus and here in Kansas. And we talked about, what kind of school is that and what's the demographic for that. And also we did predicting, like, what do you think is going to happen in this piece? So also I share with them different methods of annotating. Also try to get them over the fear of annotating. And so I think our next slide gets into that. So let's go to that. This is just more about building background knowledge. I've covered several of these, but one I should highlight before we get into annotating is reciprocal viewing is an AVID, AVID technique. AVID is achievement via individual determination. It's a program, an active learning program that Butler is part of. And reciprocal viewing is a way to make video watching much more informative and active. And so simply if you watch maybe a 10-minute clip on, for example, Sonia Sotomayor, rather than watch the whole thing, it'd be better to break it up into different key points, and that at each key point have students in a small group where they do with 3 or 4 people and have each one have a different role. For example, you might have a summarizer, a questioner, a predictor, and a clarifier, and you'd explain them roles ahead of time. And then when you stop that video, each one of them has to do their job. For example, they could talk about, well, what did we just hear? What do you predict what's going to come next? Clarify something specific, ask a question. And so if you did that maybe 2 or 3, well, probably 3 or 4 times during the video, it takes longer, but they get a lot more out of it. So you have to choose when to use that strategy, but it's very helpful for background knowledge and all sorts of things, really. Okay, now let's go on to annotating. Next slide. So I think we we all know what annotating is. We're probably really good annotators ourselves. I have a picture here from one of the books we use in one of my ALP classes, Drum Tank Pink by Adam Alter. And it just shows a picture of, I believe these are my annotations. No, this is from a student. And it just shows how the student underlined and wrote margin comments. So before I ask my students to annotate a certain piece, I will show them examples of annotating and really encourage them to think about, what could you put in the margins and what's okay and what am I expecting, which is really just that they're active readers. And also it's important at this point when you require annotating to talk about if they're using textbooks that they have to return, which at Butler we're using pretty much OERs, but like Drum Tank Pink is a book that they purchase and sell back to the bookstore or give back if they're an activity student. And so our bookstore is fine with them writing in it. They'll still accept it back. The only reason they wouldn't accept it back is if it had water damage. And so we have to talk my students kind of off a cliff about that. Like, yes, it will be bought back. But we also talk about what if you rent the books or what if you can't bring yourself to annotate? And then we talk about different methods, like maybe sticky notes. So I've seen some great different methods for that. Okay, next slide, please. So during reading, I do require my students to annotate. And I remember someone, maybe even Peter Adams, saying, students don't do optional. And so if I just send them home and say, annotate, read and annotate, but I don't expect to see the annotations in some way or the other, they're not going to get in the habit of annotating and the active reading. And then they're digging into the text, understanding the text, and then using the text in their writing. It's really not going to happen. And so different ways I've handled that is that I'll ask to see their annotations at the beginning of class. And if they didn't annotate, then that's they don't have their ticket to be part of the discussion that we're having in class. I'll have them go ahead and get started on that during class. If they complete it in a meaningful way, they can join for partial points during the discussion. There's just a lot of ways to do that. But I'm really done with not requiring annotations. Good. Deborah has a note here. I allow students to bring in their own handwritten notes for any reading quiz. Good. So that's an incentive, right? So an incentive for annotating. I also have them sometimes turn in selected pages of annotations. So if they read 6 pages, I'll say, turn in your 2 best pages if I have them turn them into Canvas. So I don't always take class time to look at those physically myself. Sometimes it's something they have to turn in ahead of time, and that's their ticket to discussion. And then often I will include in that a short reading journal where I'm asking questions that they have to answer also before class. So that accountability is really important. And I think after a while, they start to see the benefit of that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're moving into after reading. And I just want to remind us all of Bloom's taxonomy and how it starts with the lower level learning, the remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. And the reading cycle can help students move through that, particularly after reading when they get together or other ways that you have them dig deeper into that reading. So let's go to the next slide. So after reading, students come back to class or in an online class, they come back to their screens or by themselves. And this is where they share their annotations in ways that I've mentioned already through assignments that are required by those being the ticket to the discussion. And in a face-to-face class, I would put them in small groups and of the people who did have their annotations and that homework done. And then craft questions for them to discuss in those small groups that move them up the Bloom's levels. Certainly not quickly, and certainly not through all the levels. But first sharing something like, well, what did you annotate in this section? And sharing their annotations, which really opens their eyes and also gives them community and connection with each other. Also builds confidence in seeing other ways to annotate. I craft those questions carefully. I guess I talked about that. And then I also have the groups share out. How would I do that in an online class? In an online class, I have done where a discussion board is separated into, if I had 25 students, I might break them into groups of like 6 groups with 4 or 5 students. And so, and that small group would continue to meet maybe for 2 different weeks in discussions. And so trying to get them to meet with the same people and build community, but also have the same expectations for having those annotations done and being part of a discussion. Some things we've done also is would be analyzing an author's use of evidence, which is an AVID technique, investigating how writers use paragraphs. So we're looking at the say and do that Casey referred to earlier. And then let's go to the next slide. After reading benefits, this is really my favorite part. So I see how that builds and solidifies understanding and gets them into higher levels of growth in their analysis. It develops their confidence and their community with each other, their confidence as thinkers and speakers, and encourages growth mindset, because when they come in, we're not expecting that they understand everything. We're all trying to understand the text at the beginning of the discussion. That it's active and is small, if you're in a face-to-face class, it allows for movement, and that's really helpful. Different with an online class, of course, but I think just getting that community is helpful. And it encourages curiosity, inquiry, and support for one's point. So I always try to ask at the end of small group or online small group activities, what were the benefits of what we did to help solidify the importance of being ready for a discussion and being part of that discussion, and just how great it feels to be part of one and to feel your brain working like that. Let's see, it looks like we have somebody in the chat. Okay, I got it. All right, and then one more, let's see, another slide, Sam. On to writing. And so the last step of the reading cycle would be to then move into, for example, an essay assignment where they're using that reading either as a model and or as maybe a quote or an example they're using in the writing. So like Casey talked about, choosing our readings carefully for specific ideas. So for example, with Sonia Sotomayor's piece, she uses a lot of examples and details and description in her piece. And so our first paper is illustration. And so and the topic is really about the same thing she went through as far as when have you been uncomfortable or gone through difficult circumstances, and how have you adjusted to that? That reading is a model for us, but also they can bring in her as an example or a quote if they want to. So on to writing is seamlessly attached to what we did with the reading. So that encourages them to look back at their annotations and any notes they took from the discussions to use those in their essay writing. Okay, and then one more slide, please. So the big picture for the reading cycle is it seems like it takes too much time, but it really doesn't. It's so important, and I wouldn't teach really any other way because I get so many benefits from it. The students get so much from it. I like to be intentional with students about how I use the reading cycle, tell them about it and tell them why, and so they know what to expect in my class from the beginning. I also talk about how nothing we do is busy work. And so everything we're doing is connected, like it is in the reading cycle. I told you about the next bullet. Brain-based learning, try to make my students aware of how their brains are growing as a result of what we're doing. Metacognition is related to that, of course. The value and power of reflection. So that's related to having them think about back on the benefits of our discussions and annotating, taking time actually to reflect, maybe having them do quick writes is powerful at any point. So I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So we've tried to kind of sandwich this where I provided a little bit of context for the fact that there's different kinds of theoretical approaches to reading. And Kathy provided us a really nice in-depth look at one of those approaches with the reading cycle. So just to return back and kind of circle back to a couple of the things we talked about earlier, and we're now going to get back into our document. So perhaps Melanie or Kathy, would you mind recopying that since we'll be getting there in a second? Thank you. So just to kind of bring it back around to mindful reading strategies overall, and having students have this repertoire of different ways they can approach different kinds of reading tasks. So we asked you at the beginning of the session to identify the places in your class where you first assign a reading, where you start talking about summarizing and paraphrasing. Oh, Janet, I will get to you in a second, promise. Where you do peer review and where you have some feedback and revision going on. So I wanted to just make sure we provided very specific references to Carrillo's text, where you can find strategies and examples of how you can support students in the reading related things that might come up for these 4 different points in your class. And to connect back to what Kathy was talking about, the reading cycle is particularly useful when you're trying to get students going on their first reading, and anytime you're tackling a longer text in your class. Carrillo has some very specific ideas about how to help students kind of shift when they're doing summarizing and paraphrasing, and then how you rethink your approach again for peer review, and then for feedback and revision. So let me get to Janet's. I'm glad we're jumping in with thoughts here. I want to assign class points for things like reading annotations. Colleagues are leaning toward a more attendance-based grade where students automatically pass the COREC if they pass English 101. And I'll open this up. Can you speak to how you use course points and grading to encourage things like annotating? Kathy, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. That's very practical and certainly something we've thought about. At Butler, we do have them, they have to pass both courses with a C or better to move on, but I know that's probably unusual. It is tough when the setup is that they pass 060 or the co-requisite course if they pass the other, but certainly not impossible to make it work with the reading annotations. I wonder if you made the requirement then in the 101 course, so where you do have teeth really, with the course they must pass, if those habits would then pass over to 060 to the co-requisite course. Also, I would hope it as your expectations for them are important as their 101 teacher, that you would just expect the same thing in 060, that they would follow through with that. I know it's hard to get them to do things that aren't required, but I would try to get those habits built in them so they could see the benefits. I hope that helps.
Does
That-
anyone have a model where the co-rec course is separately graded from the 101, and what happens if they, for example, pass the correct course but fail 101, or they pass 101 but fail the correct course? We're having a big administrative meeting about this next week,
Mhm.
and I'd like to bring all this back to our meeting.
Sure, that's how ours is set up, Janet. So I'd be happy to talk with you. Maybe we could do that afterwards, or but yeah, that's ours is set up where you have to pass both.
Yeah.
So we thought through all that.
And that's a great question, because I've actually been at different institutions with different policies around that. And I will say, for it is rare for the student to not pass the correct if they're passing 101. I know there are some students, there are occasions, I know we all worry about, the student who kind of blows off the correct because, it counts in a certain way, right? And isn't going towards a degree plan per se. But most of the research I've read, and in my experience, most of the time, if the student is passing 101, they're going to pass the correct too. And so it's a very small percentage of students where that's an issue. But yeah, it's a really important thing to think about for sure. That's a great question. And it looks like Seth is saying at GCCC, if you fail the companion course, you can still move on if you pass English 101. Yeah, and that's a protocol several places have in place. Terry says 2 separate grades. Passing 101 is the one that determines whether they move on. But the co-rec is different, separate grade. So, yeah. Yeah, I'm just curious who all is also has that situation where you've got 2 separate grades, but it's the 101 course that actually passes people on. And Sam, if you want to weigh in, I don't know if there's anything KBOR wise that we need to be aware of around that.
There is not anything official, but it does make sense if the student passes the gateway course to allow them to move on.
Thank you. Great. And we'll also, in the last session, have more time to talk through some of these logistical sorts of issues too. Not that we can bring them up here, they're good to bring up here, but I just want to let everyone know that it might feel, my only concern about that is we know it's a little late, and I know you all are working under some curriculum deadlines. If you're like most institutions I've been at, you may be having to try to get something in a course catalog by February 1. So I know there's some decisions coming up. So if we want to talk about that a little bit more here at the end, we're really close to question time. Okay, sounds like Cheryl's in the same situation at Fort Hays. Yeah, they pass English 101, they move on, but they do have 2 different grades. Okay, great to know. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide, please. And so I know we're here at the last 15 minutes, so I don't know, I want to get a temperature check. It's a Friday afternoon. We're kind of getting into some other good topics, and I want to make sure this is how we want to use our time. But what we were thinking was get back into our slideshow and find a place where you could add in some reading activities with your scaffolding to support either the assignment you put in there or perhaps some other part of your course. It's okay if it's something else. How does that, can I get maybe if you all wouldn't mind using your React button or the chat to just either give some kind of a happy sign. It can be a thumbs up or a unicorn or whatever you feel like. If you are feeling okay with doing one more practice activity, and it's okay if you're not. If you want to give a thumbs down or a appropriate emoji that would be negative, that'd be great. Ryan's got the shades on. Love it. Love it, love it. I'm just looking down to see. Okay, looks like we got some smiles and thumbs up so far. Okay, that sounds great. Okay, so let's go ahead and spend a little time getting back into, oh, love the little kind of Groucho. Yeah, nice. Getting back into our slides. Oh, and a squirrel. Oh, yeah. I always like the dancing emojis myself. Gonna get this posted back up. If you want to go ahead and get back into the slide you were at and incorporate a reading activity. And again, if it doesn't work for the assignment you were working on, that's okay. You can always add a slide and talk about some other place where you're now thinking about adding a reading activity into your class. And it's okay, whatever feels easiest to you. If it feels easiest, you're making connections with your 101 class instead of the co-requisite, that's fine. And we'll give you all 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5, check in to do that. I am not trying to be creepy, but I am really curious. Again, we don't have time, but I'm really loving seeing what everyone's doing. And I was noticing someone who was writing about their descriptive essay talking about some color coding. And I also love to use color coding um, when I'm having students do annotation activities. I love that. Would love to hear more about how you're doing that. Thesis. Okay, great. Yep, that's what I do too. I kind of chunk it out into some different facets of the writing and kind of color code in that direction. So very cool. Oh, and I like that. Yeah, finding readings that really align with the sort of the type of writing, sort of seeing a real world example in action. That's a great idea. And some of your slides, you already had reading incorporated in some way. It's just that we don't always think of some of the things we do as reading activities. At least that's one of the connections I know I've made as I did more reading and thinking about this. So yeah, even when we're having students look at an example and identify different parts, it's a reading skill, right? They have to figure out where those different parts of an essay are. That's great. Ooh, I love the reading guides for the Spider-Man comics. Um, I worked in an institution one time that required everyone in Comp 101 and 102 to have students reading these very intense texts. And um, and I had a lot of students at that institution who were coming in with like a fourth, fifth, sixth grade reading level, and they were being given things that are like a 14th, like, pretty hardcore. So I would have them do handouts, and I would separate them out into groups by chapter, and then they would present their handouts to the class. And that was a way, and it may be a little bit like your reading guide. And I do some similar things in some of the literature classes I've taught as well, where I tend to go a little heavier on my writing in my literature classes. And so, yeah, that's great. Love that. I know we're winding down now. Everyone feel free to continue to work on things if you are. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get into our next couple of slides. Oh, I like that, Seth, with on the different colored paper to get them into groups. Yeah, I love that. That way they're coming prepared and they're all doing that together. That's great. So a couple other considerations, and these are things that came out of questions from our last session. So we just wanted to make sure that we address some of these things. So one quick thing I've talked about already, but I'll just reinforce. Awkward as it might feel like, I know for me that it can be really awkward, but the more you can model for students your metacognitive processing, I'll do that with paraphrasing, I'll do it with summarizing. Even when I give them feedback, I'll try to pretend like if I got this kind of feedback, or I'll even show them feedback I've received, which is always awkward and fun also. But so they can kind of really see this process in action. And for online classes, I'll even record myself, just kind of going through that process. And so they can listen and watch that. For students who are needing more substantial reading support, and I know that many of you are also, I have also worked in those contexts where I have had students who maybe we're actually closer into still needing to learn how to read kind of space. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what we can do, right? When we're doing a CoREC 101 class. And so what I've done at previous institutions, at one institution, I actually worked with a community literacy organization. And over time, that literacy organization ended up offering some free reading classes that students were able to take. And then that could either be at the same time as they were in a course or before. Ideally, it just kind of depended. I have worked with adult basic ed programs before to make sure that students who are needing more substantial reading support get funneled for reading support there. And I've actually helped them with creating curriculum to kind of scaffold that up into the class that the relevant class for that institution. And having non-prerequisite reading classes is also an option. So, so those are a couple different things. And a lot of this is going to depend on your institutional context. I've worked in rural areas where I didn't have access to all of these options. And so, you know, I turned in the best direction that I was able to. And that's something I'm happy to talk with folks about more if, you know, anyone's interested. And I'll just throw in my email account just in case anyone wants to talk. And then multilingual students. I have actually taught specialized co-requisite sections for multilingual students. There's a lot, you need a lot more cultural context support for those classes, and you may want to work closely with your writing center or again, your AEL kind of program, depending on your institutional context. I have worked at community colleges, for instance, where we had very robust you know, ELL, English Language Learner kinds of programs, or ESL programs, or AEL programs. And that's actually what I worked with at one institution. And when we actually paired an ESL class with my English 101 class. At other institutions, I've known of people who things had to be a little more separated out. They weren't able to make that work. Again, it's a little outside of the scope and not quite the purview of everything going on right now, but there are options there. And again, I'm happy to talk to you all more. I've actually got several presentations about that multilingual work because I taught that class for a few years and really enjoyed that. You may also want to consider, if you haven't heard about translanguaging, I'm happy to talk about that more with folks sometime too. The idea being having students using multiple languages in your classroom environments. And that's a lot of fun and presents some interesting opportunities, I will call them, to think about what you're doing and how you make that function. And then last but not least, we have mentioned West Ed's reading apprenticeship approach as well. Looks like Jeannie from GCCC, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. ESL correct sections, 3 hours of credit, so they have more time for just-in-time support and feedback for the writing they're doing. Excellent. Awesome. So it sounds like we have another fabulous person to talk to if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about that. Great. So let's go ahead and I think wrap things up here pretty fast. We're almost at time. Quick final thoughts. As people have been thinking about this, sometimes the temptation is just to sort of throw in a few reading things here, throw in a few reading things there. The more that we can creatively integrate effective approaches through a sort of multi-dimensional literacy lens, the more we're going to benefit our students. And I love the ideas that everyone's bringing today. This was such a great conversation, and I love seeing all of the ideas. So thank you all for this great conversation. And I think that's it. I think we'll have to wrap it up. But just a reminder, more to come in February. Looking forward to seeing everyone and talking again. Thank you all for being here.
Hey, Casey,
Mm-hmm.
the reference thing you talked about, a reference sheet.
Yes,
Where is that?
that should be at the very end of the presentation.
So they just click on it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It as a separate document. That way everybody could.
Okay. Okay. I can't tell for sure that it's like a link, I guess.
Okay. Sam, let me know if that doesn't come up. And I can email you a copy of that to post.
It came up for me.
Okay.
And Sam,
I
I'll go
will-
ahead and clean up the slides that everybody wrote on and then send you the final, or let you know when it's final. You probably already have the link, right?
I do. Thank you. Yes. I thought I might try to share that reference handout.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. They may not realize.
Yeah.
And then that's so so helpful. Casey, thanks.
And we will get the slides posted very soon. I don't know how quickly our folks will be able to trim down the recording, but we will get the recording up as well as soon as we possibly can.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.